I played the video, right as my father stepped up to give his speech. And within 12 seconds, the legacy of my family, a dynasty praised for 3 generations, crumbled. In the video, he said, "Clean up the body, no trace. The body was my little brother. I was once the pampered princess. Now I'm the one who pulled the curtain back for the world to see. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss our next gripping and emotional episodes." The rain hadn't stopped since morning, an insistent cold drizzle that clung to black coats and pearl veils like grief itself. Charlotte Whitmore stood at the edge of the Whitmore family cemetery, heels sinking into the muddy earth, her hands clenched in black leather gloves. Beneath the wide canopy that shielded the casket, the town's most influential names had gathered like silent sentinels, judges, senators, CEOs, all dressed in solemn hues, mouthing polite condolences. Cameras clicked quietly from a respectful distance. In death, Liam Whitmore was being honored like royalty. In life, he'd been ignored. Charlotte's gaze remained fixed on the mahogany coffin as it was lowered into the ground, each mechanical groan of the winch tightening something behind her ribs. Her younger brother, 26, the boy who used to sneak cigars from their father's study and draw cartoon monsters on the back of legal documents, dead. Officially cardiac arrest, unofficially questions no one wanted to ask. The eulogy read by their family's longtime pastor painted Liam as a bright light dimmed too soon, a brilliant soul dedicated to the law, a beloved son of Franklin and Elaine Whitmore. Charlotte almost scoffed. Brilliant, yes, beloved not by them. Beside her, Elaine Whitmore, perfect in every thread, held a handkerchief she hadn't used. Her expression didn't waver once. Franklin, towering and distinguished, accepted every handshake with the measured humility of a grieving father. No one saw Charlotte flinch when his hand brushed her shoulder. She didn't step back. But she didn't meet his eyes either. Charlotte, a soft voice whispered behind her. She turned. Martha, the family's oldest housekeeper, nearing 70, with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much. Martha stepped forward quietly, careful not to draw attention. In her palm was a small brass key, cold and old. He said, "If anything happened to him," Martha whispered, eyes glossy, "I was to give this to you. Not your father, not your mother, only you." Charlotte stared at it. For a second, her breath hitched. Then she took it, wrapping her fingers around it tightly. "What is it?" But Martha just shook her head. "It's not for me to say, but it's in the old cellar, behind the Syrah shelf." Before Charlotte could respond, Martha had stepped away, vanishing like mist into the sea of black umbrellas. Back at the estate, the reception was a page from a political campaign. Caterers in white gloves, crystal glasses of champagne string quartet, playing something too hopeful. Franklin gave a short speech, carefully crafted ending with a toast to Liam's bravery and legacy. People clapped. Charlotte didn't. She slipped away before dessert. The Whitmore estate had stood for over a century, a Georgian monstrosity of wealth and discipline. It sat like a judgment above the rolling hills of Fairfax County, with its stone lions, ivy-covered walls, and secrets older than its bricks. Charlotte made her way down the west hallway past portraits of long-dead ancestors, all men with names carved on courtroom plaques. She descended the rear staircase to the cellar, a place once forbidden to her and Liam after they broke a 100-year-old bottle playing hide-and-seek. The air was cooler here, musty, thick with the scent of aged oak and earth. She flicked on the light. Rows of wine shelves greeted her, tall and symmetrical. She walked straight to the Syrah section, 5 rows from the back. She counted like Liam used to in their games. 12 bottles across. 3 down. There it was. A thin seam in the paneling, barely visible but unmistakable once seen. She hesitated. The brass key still in her glove slid easily into a keyhole hidden behind the 4th bottle. There was a soft click. The panel swung inward with a reluctant creak. Charlotte stared into the dark. It wasn't a wine cabinet. It was a door. Swallowing hard, she stepped inside, flicking the light switch by instinct. A single overhead bulb buzzed to life. The hidden room was narrow and low-ceilinged walls lined with locked filing cabinets, an old safe in the corner, and a wooden desk covered in dust. On the wall, scribbled in chalk above the desk, WH14A. Liam's handwriting. She'd know it anywhere. Her knees weakened slightly. On the desk, a single envelope. Her name printed in blue ink. Not typed. Handwritten. She picked it up. Inside was a flash drive and a single sentence scrawled on notebook paper. "If you're reading this, I'm already dead." And if you open what's on that drive, you'll know why. Charlotte's chest tightened. Suddenly, the quiet of the cellar felt sinister. She turned off the light, closed the secret door behind her, and clutched the key so tightly it bit into her palm. Whatever was on that drive wasn't just about Liam. It was about the Whitmores. And maybe, just maybe, it was about how far her father was willing to go to silence the one son who refused to obey. The click of the key echoed louder this time, like a gunshot in the tomb-still cellar. Charlotte pushed the hidden panel open again and stepped inside, heart pounding like a warning drum against her ribs. The single overhead bulb buzzed above her, flickering faintly. Dust floated like memory in the air. The room was colder than she remembered. Maybe it wasn't colder. Maybe it was just what she knew now. That Liam had built this hiding place, that he had left her the key, that he was dead, and this was his voice from the grave. She approached the desk, its wood cracked with age and grief. A small lockbox sat beside the flash drive he'd left in the envelope. Its code was already punched in 1432, their old apartment number, when their mother exiled them from the main house for being too loud. Inside were files, thick, heavy stacks of documents, some in plastic sleeves, others brittle with age. Her hands trembled as she reached for the first, a folder labeled Vanderson Trust, Bermuda. Bank statements. Wire transfers. 8 figures. Names she recognized. Offshore accounts traced to shell companies. Some linked to known political donors, some to sitting judges. She exhaled sharply. The next file, WH Legal Holdings, internal. She flipped through pages of meeting minutes, legal briefings, conversations that clearly weren't meant to be recorded. Her father's signature, Franklin Whitmore, was at the bottom of nearly every page. This wasn't just oversight. This was design, structure, a web of laundering hidden behind philanthropy and legal jargon. Then nestled between 2 folders, a black flash drive, unlabeled, heavy in her palm. She slid it into the old laptop still connected to the desk. The screen took a second to wake up, humming slowly to life. No password. A single folder opened automatically for Charlotte. Inside 3 video files, she clicked on the first. The camera was hidden, possibly in a briefcase or a pocket. The angle was low, but the voices were unmistakable. Her father's deep, authoritative baritone, another voice, nervous younger. If this gets out, we're all ruined. Then you know what needs to be done. Franklin's voice was colder than she'd ever heard it. He's too curious, too idealistic. I told Elaine it would come to this. The camera angle shifted slightly. She caught a sliver of his face, his hand, a glass of scotch. Liam's name was mentioned, once, twice, then a phrase that stopped her breath entirely. Make it look natural, no questions. The second file was worse. It was Liam, her brother, sitting at this very desk, his face pale, sweaty. He looked straight into the lens. If you're watching this, I was right. They know, and they'll never let it go public. Charlotte, I'm sorry. I should have told you everything earlier, but I didn't want to pull you into this. Not unless I had to. I guess now I have to. He paused, lips trembling. Dad's not who you think he is. The third file was a clipped surveillance video from a restaurant, her father shaking hands with a man she didn't recognize. A USB was passed under the table. A contract. Then Franklin whispered something caught only faintly by the mic. No sons, no mistakes, just legacy. Charlotte snapped the laptop closed. Her knees buckled. She sank to the floor. Not from shock, though there was that. Not from grief, though it nearly swallowed her whole. But from rage. A molten, ancient, rising rage that she had buried beneath years of obedience, of silence, of pretending. The Whitmores were never a family. They were a firm, a dynasty held together by contracts and secrets. And Liam had tried to blow it open. He died for that. Her hands curled into fists. She stayed in that room for what felt like hours, the sound of her own breath, her only companion. Then slowly she gathered everything, the files, the drive, the laptop, and locked them in a leather satchel. She turned off the light, closed the panel behind her. When she stepped out of the cellar, dawn was already bleeding into the sky. She didn't go to her bedroom. She went to the main hallway, the one lined with portraits of her father, grandfather, great-grandfather, all stern-faced, all lit with pride and oil paint. She stood before the largest one Franklin Whitmore painted at age 45, arms crossed before the marble columns of the Supreme Court. Then, without hesitation, she reached up, grabbed the frame, and yanked it off the wall. The crash echoed like thunder. The glass shattered. She didn't stop. One by one, she tore them down. Each ancestor. Each fraud. Her heels crunched the glass as she paced the hallway like a hurricane, her breath sharp, uncontrolled. In the living room, a photo of the family at the governor's ball, Charlotte in a silver dress, Liam in black tie, Franklin's hand on both their shoulders was next. She picked it up and threw it into the fireplace. It cracked in two. She stared at the flames for a long time. Her voice in her head was steady now. Cold. Final. If the truth lives at the bottom, then I'll pull the whole damn family down with it. Charlotte Whitmore turned away from the ashes and walked upstairs. Not to grieve, to plan. The morning light filtering through the stained glass windows painted the Whitmore dining room in hues far too delicate for what Charlotte now knew. At the long oak table, she sat like a statue, chin tilted, hands folded neatly in her lap, as Franklin Whitmore read aloud from the Richmond Review, his voice thick with self-importance. "A legacy of leadership," he quoted, eyes gleaming. "The Whitmore name continues to anchor the pillars of justice in Virginia." He looked over the rim of his coffee cup. "That's us, sweetheart. Anchors." Charlotte smiled. It was the kind of smile she'd perfected at prep school luncheons, at charity galas, at dinners where cameras flashed and family mattered only so far as image. It didn't reach her eyes, but then in this house nothing ever had. "I'm ready to help," she said softly. Franklin blinked. Help? The firm, the legacy, everything. She reached for the sugar bowl and stirred her tea slowly. "You need someone to carry it forward. I want to be that person." He leaned back, watching her. "After everything with Liam, I thought you might step back." She met his gaze, unflinching. Liam was fragile. He didn't understand what this world demands. "I do." Silence pulsed between them. Finally he nodded. "Good girl." That afternoon, Charlotte stood before her mirror in the dressing room, same place she had sobbed into her curls as a teenager wishing to be anyone else. She zipped up a navy blue dress, fitted, conservative, commanding. Franklin always liked her best in blue, said it made her look trustworthy. She pinned her mother's pearl brooch to her collar, the ultimate symbol of obedient femininity. Obedient, she nearly laughed. Inside her handbag, beneath a compact and a velvet lipstick case, the flash drive lay tucked in a hidden pouch. Her heartbeat doubled every time her hand brushed against it. A quiet reminder of the war she was now waging, one no one could see coming. She walked out into the world wearing a mask so flawless even she almost believed it. The coffee shop was unremarkable: gray tables, mismatched chairs, the hum of overworked espresso machines. It was the kind of place no Whitmore would be caught dead in. That's why she chose it. She spotted him instantly. Ethan Ramirez. Same slouched posture, same anxious energy, like he was permanently braced for impact. The last time they'd spoken, it was college. She'd been planning law school. He'd been planning to join the FBI. They'd kissed once. She broke it off before it became something real. Now here he was, still wearing off-the-rack suits, still too sincere for his own good. "Charlotte Whitmore," he said, standing as she approached. "I thought you'd fallen off the map." "I was busy being the dutiful daughter," she said coolly. "Turns out duty makes for a very good disguise." She sat her posture perfect and waited until the waitress brought her tea before she spoke again. "I have something," she said quietly, "and I need you to keep your hands off the trigger until I say." Ethan's brow creased. "Something like what?" "Evidence. Witnessed bribery, money laundering, federal-level corruption tied to multiple active officials. All of it linked to my father." Ethan leaned forward, voice low. "You have documentation?" "Better. I have video, wire transfers, voice recordings, a full list of names." She took a breath. "And proof that he had my brother killed for digging too close." His face paled. "Jesus." Charlotte's voice sharpened. "Don't Jesus me, Ethan. I didn't come here for shock. I came for action. Quiet, strategic action." He composed himself, straightening. "If what you're saying is true, we need to get it into the system immediately. I can get it in front of our internal investigators." "No!" She cut him off. "I don't want this buried in some sealed indictment. I don't want a plea deal that lets him keep his name or his golf clubs. I want this public." Ethan blinked. "You want a media trial? I want a reckoning." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I want the whole country to see who Franklin Whitmore really is. I want his name to rot in public memory. I want people to say it like a curse." He hesitated. "That's not how this works, Charlotte. You leak this to the press and you risk everything: chain of custody evidence, admissibility, retaliation." "You think I care about admissibility?" she snapped. "My brother's body is in the ground, Ethan." "And everyone shook my father's hand at the funeral." She leaned across the table, her voice trembling now, not with fear but fury. "Do you know what it's like to bury someone and smile for cameras at the same time? To stand beside the man who killed your sibling and call him dad, because that's what the world expects?" Ethan sat back speechless. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to help me do this right. You said once you wanted to change the world. Well, this is it. Right here, right now. He exhaled slowly. What do you want me to do? Charlotte lowered her voice. You keep me off every official radar. I feed you names, places, files, slow drip. Just enough to keep you ahead. Meanwhile, I'll build the stage. What stage? A public stage. One no one can walk away from. I'm going to make my father feel the one thing he's never felt in his life: humiliation. Ethan swallowed. And when he figures out it's you, she didn't blink. Then I'll let him watch everything burn. Later that evening, back at the estate, Charlotte stepped into her father's study. Franklin was on the phone laughing, sipping something dark in a crystal glass. When he saw her, he waved her in. She took a seat across from him, crossing her legs at the ankle, resting her hands in her lap like a lady. How was your afternoon? He asked, swirling the drink. Productive, she said. He raised his glass. You're going to do great things, Charlotte. You're my legacy now. She smiled. Yes, I am. In her pocket, her phone buzzed once a text from Ethan Drive received. First file decrypted. You weren't exaggerating. Charlotte stood, kissed her father's cheek, and walked out of the room. Not his daughter anymore. His executioner. The ballroom glittered like a cathedral of deceit. Crystal chandeliers hung from a vaulted ceiling dressed in white silk. Soft golden lighting bathed the room in opulence, reflecting off champagne flutes and polished marble floors. Waiters glided between clusters of guests, offering caviar canapés and aged Bordeaux. A string quartet played something tasteful, forgettable. All around, the rich and powerful laughed with hollow teeth. Charlotte stood at the top of the staircase, overlooking it all, wrapped in a floor-length emerald gown her mother had once worn to the state attorney's gala. For tradition, Elaine had said, clasping the zipper. Charlotte had smiled. Now she tightened her hand on the stair rail. Below, a swarm of photographers caught sight of Franklin entering through the grand doors. Applause rippled like a wave through the crowd. Flashbulbs popped. Franklin Whitmore, someone called out, lifting a glass. The man of the hour. He drank it in. Charlotte descended the stairs, each step measured. The string quartet shifted seamlessly into a fanfare-style crescendo as her heels tapped across the marble. Franklin turned just in time to offer her his arm. She accepted it. My daughter, he announced to the gathering crowd, the future of Whitmore and Whitmore, the pride of my legacy. Cheers! Claps! The governor himself leaned in to shake her hand. I've heard you're brilliant, he said. I'm thorough, Charlotte replied, smiling coolly. A senator kissed her cheek. A CEO from Atlanta praised her sharp mind. A Supreme Court associate nodded and said, You'll make history. She thanked them all with a practiced tilt of her chin, her teeth flashing just enough. They didn't see the blade behind the smile. They never did. Franklin leaned close. I'm proud of you, he whispered, voice tinged with bourbon and nostalgia. Look at this crowd. This is what we built, you and me. Charlotte didn't look at him. She looked beyond him to the video wall at the end of the ballroom, to the control booth Ethan had secured from the upper mezzanine, to the black suit standing near the exit wearing a disguised mic and earpiece, to the quiet ticking trap winding toward detonation. A woman in pearls asked Charlotte what it felt like to inherit a dynasty. She said terrifying. Laughter. Franklin clinked glasses with the governor. She's got my sharpness. And her mother's grace. Across the room, Charlotte caught sight of Elaine in a silver sheath dress, hair pinned back with surgical precision. Their eyes met. Elaine raised her flute in a toast. Charlotte raised hers in return. A waiter approached with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Charlotte took a shrimp canapé, didn't eat it. Would you like to freshen up before your speech? Franklin asked, resting a hand on her back. I'm ready, she said. I've been preparing for this my whole life. The podium stood at the center of the ballroom's elevated platform. Behind it, a massive digital screen loomed, currently displaying a slideshow of family photos, black and white shots of Franklin in his first courtroom. Charlotte and Liam as toddlers in matching tartan. The old firm building with its brass plaque gleaming. The timer was counting down in the upper corner. 5 minutes until the official speech. Charlotte's fingers brushed her phone in the clutch by her side. The signal was green. All live feeds were primed. One press and the cameras scattered throughout the room, hidden in floral arrangements behind vents embedded in the podium itself, would stream across encrypted channels to 3 secured servers, 2 news outlets, and 1 whistleblower database. She saw Ethan across the room standing near the champagne fountain. He didn't look at her, but his slight shift, left hand to jacket then back, was their signal. Everything was in place. Her heart beat with a mechanical rhythm, steady, surgical. Underneath her skin, adrenaline burned like ice, but her face remained composed, luminous, a goddess carved in vengeance. A guest tapped a glass with a spoon. Murmurs faded. All eyes turned to the stage. Franklin stepped forward, one arm raised, voice confident. Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests and members of the Whitmore family. Applause cut him off. He waited, grinning, then continued. 50 years ago, my father opened the doors to a firm that would go on to redefine legal excellence in this state. He believed in law as a weapon of peace, and tonight I believe he would be proud to see that legacy stronger than ever. More clapping. Whitmore and Whitmore has weathered political storms, economic recessions, and cultural shifts. But one thing has never changed: our commitment to justice. Charlotte watched unmoving as her father spoke the word justice like it didn't taste like blood. And now, I am proud to introduce the next bearer of that legacy, a brilliant attorney, a fierce advocate, and my daughter, Charlotte Whitmore. The ballroom erupted. Charlotte stepped forward as Franklin made way. He touched her arm again as she passed. Take your place, sweetheart. She did. At the podium, the lights caught the shimmer in her eyes, not tears, steel. She looked out over the sea of faces, smiling, clapping, trusting. And she smiled back. The camera in the flower arrangement caught everything. 3 minutes until the screen changed. 3 minutes until everything shattered. She touched the edge of the podium and leaned into the microphone. Good evening, Charlotte said, voice clear, calm, low. Thank you for being here. Tonight is more than a celebration of 50 years of legal success. It's a tribute to the very foundation of our society: truth, integrity, and accountability. No one noticed the slight flicker of the lights. No one noticed the countdown had disappeared from the upper corner of the screen. But Charlotte did, and she let the moment stretch. My father has always believed in legacy. She continued, her voice growing stronger. That what we build should last. That what we protect should matter. Pause. The question is, what happens when legacy is built on secrets? Silence now. Confused faces, heads tilting. Elaine narrowed her eyes. Franklin frowned. Charlotte looked into the lens hidden behind the floral centerpiece and pressed the small button inside her palm. And the room began to change. The invitations were printed on black cardstock edged in gold foil, elegant, austere, exactly the way Franklin Whitmore liked things. Across the top, embossed in gleaming serif, Whitmore & Whitmore LLP, 50 years of legacy in law. Charlotte read the words again, then dropped the mock-up on her desk like it stung. 50 years. Half a century of power laundering through the language of justice. Half a century of manipulation hidden beneath precedent and professionalism. And she was going to bury it all on the very night meant to celebrate it. She sat in her father's office later that afternoon, her tone crisp, polite, every syllable measured. We should make it big, she said, crossing one leg over the other. Invite press, alumni, judges, maybe even stream parts of the evening online public goodwill. Franklin arched an approving brow. That's savvy. Good PR. Charlotte smiled. I thought you might say that. He stood and clapped a hand on her shoulder. You're making me proud, Charlotte. She nodded, her voice silk-wrapped steel. I'm just getting started. The planning moved fast, faster than Charlotte expected. It was as if the entire city couldn't wait to celebrate the Whitmore name again. RSVPs poured in, politicians, legal scholars, former clients with heavy pockets and heavier secrets. Even the governor's office confirmed attendance. She worked late into the night, supposedly finalizing details, seating charts, menu options, playlist samples. But her real work happened behind a second set of plans locked inside a flash-encrypted drive. In a private conference room not listed on the official floor plan, she began installing discrete security cameras, pinhead lenses embedded in corner sconces and air vents. One near the podium, another in the private lounge where Franklin often retreated mid-event to conduct his quiet business. Ethan had sent her the gear himself. Custom firmware he'd written. Encrypted live relay. One tap and it all goes public. She placed her phone on the table beside the camera switchboard. Her hand trembled slightly. It was happening. The trap was being set. In her room, Charlotte stood before the full-length mirror rehearsal dress, clinging to her like glass. She held her note cards in one hand, blank, meaningless. The real speech wasn't written down. It lived inside her chest like a loaded weapon. She stared at her reflection. Polished, perfect, the daughter of Whitmore. And yet, her fingers clutched the top of the mirror. She leaned closer, voice low, raw. You've controlled judges, bought senators, murdered your own son. She paused, eyes burning. You always said words were weapons, father. I'm going to kill you with yours. Her voice shook, then steadied. I will kill your reputation. I will burn your legacy. I will make the world watch as you crumble. She lowered her head for a moment, inhaled. Then she looked up again. I'll smile as you fall. The next day, she tested the feed from the ballroom's private signal hub. The cameras worked perfectly, fluid angles, crystal audio. She could see every inch of the room, the podium, the guests, the face her father would wear when the world began to unravel. She imagined the silence that would fall when the screen behind him flickered to life. When the words Whitmore, evidence of corruption and murder, flashed across the ballroom. When the voice of Franklin Whitmore himself played out loud, recorded in grainy video saying, "Make it look natural, no questions," Charlotte's stomach turned. Not from fear, from hunger for justice. She turned off the feed and sat in the dark. The silence was heavy, but it was hers. She reached for a pen, scribbled one last line on the edge of a napkin beside her laptop. Not for the speech, not for the press. Just for herself. He built a kingdom of silence. I will answer it with a scream the world cannot unhear. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself a small smile. Not a mask, not a lie. A smile that meant war. Franklin adjusted his cufflinks with the same self-assured smirk he wore in every courtroom for the past 30 years. He walked onto the stage with theatrical poise, waving to the crowd like a politician who had just won another landslide. The lights shifted to follow him, casting a glow on his silver hair and perfectly pressed tuxedo. Behind him, the screen still displayed the Whitmore and Whitmore logo, a lion holding a sword over a set of scales. He gripped the microphone with practiced ease. "I want to thank all of you," he began, his voice warm and commanding, "for honoring not just a firm, but a philosophy. A belief that law is the great equalizer, that when wielded with courage—" Click! The microphone cut out. A static pop hissed through the ballroom speakers. Then the screen behind him flickered. Once, twice, the logo vanished, and in its place, a grainy low-resolution video, surveillance style, dull colors, a timestamp in the corner. It was Franklin, sitting behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, jaw tight with rage. "No, I don't care what he found," the recording played. Franklin's voice unmistakable. "You handle it, no mess, no press. He was my son, but he made a choice. And now we make ours. You clean it up. You understand me? I don't want to see a single goddamn trace." Gasps. One woman dropped her wine glass. It shattered against marble. Another man muttered, "Jesus Christ." Franklin spun on his heel to look at the screen, the color draining from his face. The video continued. More footage, money being wired, offshore accounts, documents stamped with his signature. A second clip, audio only, of him laughing, mocking that idiot Liam, snooping around like he was Sherlock Holmes. The room plunged into stunned silence. And then, FBI, a command echoed like thunder through the chamber. Doors burst open. Men in suits flooded in, weapons holstered, badges raised. Franklin Whitmore, the lead agent, called, voice amplified through a portable megaphone. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and federal racketeering." The room erupted into chaos. Flashbulbs fired from stunned reporters. Guests backed away, chairs scraping. Someone screamed. Elaine stood frozen, her champagne flute still delicately balanced in her hand. Franklin didn't move. He looked directly into the crowd, searching. And then he saw her. Charlotte stood at the foot of the stage. Calm, still. Her hands by her sides, her posture regal. In that moment, she looked more like his father's portrait than any memory of herself. Their eyes locked. His mouth opened, perhaps to speak, to deny, to beg. She stepped forward, heels clicking like gunshots across the floor. The agents grabbed his arms, began reading him his rights. "You have the right to remain silent." Still she moved forward. One step, then another, until she was inches from him. Franklin was breathing hard now, confusion turning to desperation. "Charlotte," he rasped. "What is this?" She leaned in, voice so low only he could hear. "Liam says hello," she whispered, ice in her tone. From the other side, Franklin's knees buckled. The agents held him upright. Charlotte stepped back and watched them drag her father down the stage stairs past the ballroom crowd that had once worshipped him. Some guests pulled out their phones, filming. Others whispered, wept, or stormed out. And yet Charlotte stood still. All her life she'd been taught that power was about control, about silence, about never blinking. But now she understood. Real power was truth, brutal, loud, and irreversible. And she'd just set it free. The ballroom was empty now. Chairs stood overturned like corpses on a battlefield. Silverware glinted among shattered glass. Crimson wine bled across the white linen tablecloths. What remained of the Whitmore legacy was being scrubbed by hotel staff with downcast eyes and urgent hands. Charlotte didn't stay for the cleanup. She was already in her car, speeding through the wet streets of Westbridge, headlights slicing through fog, her phone buzzing with unanswered calls from journalists, allies, enemies. None of them mattered. Not now. The hard drive sat on the seat beside her like a second heartbeat. The one Liam left behind, the one that cracked her father's empire wide open. But something was wrong. It had been gnawing at her ever since she saw the broadcast go live. A flicker in the footage, a half-second stutter she couldn't explain, a redacted timestamp, an edit. It hadn't registered then. Too much adrenaline, too much spectacle. But now that the storm had passed, her instincts whispered, someone tampered with Liam's file, and it wasn't her. In her study, Charlotte connected the drive to an offline system. Ethan had built an encrypted air-gapped terminal meant for sensitive material. She bypassed the autoplay function and accessed the raw data. Her fingers moved fast lines of code streaming down the screen. Then she saw it. A segment marked modified. Metadata scrubbed clean, but not entirely. Whoever had done it wasn't a novice, but they also hadn't expected Charlotte to look deeper. She dug. Beneath the altered segment, she found an original copy, larger in file size, slightly different hash. It was an earlier version of the clip, the one Liam had first recorded. She clicked play. The video unfolded the same way: Franklin's voice, the conversation, the order. But there was more. Before the end, after the infamous clean it up command, there was a pause. Then Franklin's voice again. He's already told Elaine. She agrees. If it keeps us clean, it's done. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. Elaine. Her mother hadn't just known. She'd approved. No, she'd helped. Charlotte scrubbed the drive for network traces, IP logs, last access points. One trace stood out, a remote connection routed through a VPN traced back to a secure residential address. Her mother's townhouse in Boston. Password protected. The encryption was old school but strong military-grade RSA. But Charlotte had spent her teenage years breaking into Liam's firewalls for fun. This wasn't a challenge. It was a confirmation. Her mother had altered Liam's file before she ever got to it. Her mind raced back through the past weeks, the way Elaine had toasted her at the gala, the faint smirk when Franklin was arrested, the unshaken calm. She hadn't been shocked. She had been watching it unfold exactly the way she planned it. Charlotte felt her stomach twist, not in grief, in rage. She opened her laptop and searched public records, bank transfers, nonprofit grants. And there it was. A series of anonymous donations routed through shell organizations: Whitmore Family Trust Fund, Blackgate Legal Outreach, Caspian Wellness Initiative, funneled into private accounts in Luxembourg, Malta, and Belize, each under fake board member names. But the signatures on the creation forms: Elaine M. Whitmore. Her mother had built a second empire under Franklin's name, a hidden layer, one that Liam had almost uncovered and likely died for trying. Charlotte opened her encrypted chat with Ethan. Charlotte. I need everything you can dig up on Elaine Whitmore. She's not just complicit, she's the architect. A pause. Then Ethan replied, Ethan, you sure? Charlotte. She used me. She used all of us. Franklin was the blade, but she was the hand that swung it. Another pause. Ethan. Then let's expose the hand. I'll start digging. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, staring at the digital evidence glowing in front of her. Her mother had looked her in the eyes that night, knowing she was sending Franklin to the wolves, knowing Charlotte would find it cathartic, knowing she'd think it was over. But it wasn't. Charlotte closed the video files, powered down the drive. This wasn't justice yet. It was only halftime. The Whitmore estate sat in silence, its windows glowing faintly against the falling dusk. The old sycamore trees rustled in the wind, but inside everything was still, too still. Charlotte stood at the base of the grand staircase, staring up at the second floor, where a sliver of warm light spilled from beneath the door of her mother's private study. Her heels echoed against the marble as she ascended. With each step, the weight of what she knew pressed harder on her spine. She had rehearsed this confrontation all afternoon. In her head, she'd imagined rage screaming accusations like daggers. But now, as she stood before the double doors, she felt none of that. Only clarity. She knocked once firmly. Elaine's voice came through, calm as always. Come in, darling. Charlotte pushed open the door. Elaine sat behind her mahogany desk, a crystal decanter half full of amber liquid beside her. A pair of reading glasses rested at the edge of a leather-bound ledger. She didn't look surprised. She looked expectant. Would you like a drink? Elaine asked, pouring herself a glass of bourbon without waiting for an answer. No, Charlotte said, stepping inside. She closed the door gently behind her. I came for the truth. Elaine swirled the bourbon in her glass. Then sit. Truth deserves to be spoken sitting down. Charlotte remained standing. Elaine chuckled lightly, gesturing toward the seat across from her. You've always been dramatic. You get that from your father. Funny, Charlotte said. I thought I got his need to kill things that threaten him from you. Elaine's hand froze mid-sip, and then she set the glass down. You know, she said. I know everything. Charlotte replied, pulling her phone from her coat pocket, discreetly tapping the record button and placing it inside her purse on the chair beside her. Elaine leaned back, watching her carefully. So, you found the footage, the money, the edits. I found Liam's original file. I saw the timestamp, and I traced the remote access. Straight to your townhouse. Elaine didn't flinch. Good girl, she said quietly. Charlotte's brow furrowed. You're not going to deny it. What would be the point? Elaine replied. You're smart. You got that from me. Charlotte stepped closer. Why? Why manipulate everything? Why let Franklin take the fall? Elaine tilted her head. Because he was built to fall. Charlotte's breath caught. Elaine continued, her tone smooth, almost maternal. Your father was never strong enough to manage what we built. He was arrogant, loud, predictable. I needed him to draw fire. You mean, to be the scapegoat, Charlotte said. Elaine smiled faintly. Scapegoats are only necessary when the herd is worth protecting. You're not protecting anyone, Charlotte snapped. You orchestrated your son's murder. Elaine's eyes narrowed. Liam was unstable. He threatened everything I spent 20 years holding together. Charlotte stared at her mother as if seeing her for the first time. You don't even sound sorry. Elaine leaned forward, her voice soft, lethal. Do you know what it's like to manage a dynasty with men who constantly underestimate you, who think their last name is all the armor they need? I didn't just survive in this family, Charlotte. I preserved it. Charlotte's hand tightened into a fist. You destroyed it. Elaine raised her brows. Did I? Franklin's gone, yes? But the Whitmore name is still on every courthouse wall. Still whispered in legal circles like scripture. You think you exposed something? You just cut off a limb to stop the bleeding. Charlotte's voice trembled not with fear but fury. Liam died trying to expose the truth. He died trying to shame the family. There's a difference. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then Charlotte said, You're done. Elaine arched a brow. Am I? Charlotte reached into her purse and pulled out the phone. She tapped the screen and held it up. The waveform of their conversation danced across the screen. You've been recording, Elaine asked. Charlotte smiled. Of course. You taught me to always have an insurance policy. Elaine's mouth twitched with a flicker of amusement. That's my girl. Charlotte ignored it. She forwarded the file to Ethan with a single tap. Then she turned back toward the door. You'll be hearing from federal agents soon, she said. Elaine didn't panic. She merely sipped her bourbon. I should have known, she said. You were always the quiet one. Watching, absorbing. It's not the loud ones who bring down empires. Charlotte paused at the door, her hand on the knob. Elaine added, You can tear it all down, Charlotte, but you'll still have Whitmore blood in your veins. Charlotte turned slowly. Her face was calm, clear. I'm going to burn every brick of this legacy, she said, and I'll bleed if I have to. But when it's done, no one will remember your name. She opened the door. Elaine's voice followed her out, laced with something between admiration and warning. Then I hope you're ready to finish what you started, because now, you're the one they'll all be watching. Charlotte didn't respond. She stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind her. This wasn't the end, but it was the first moment she'd seen her mother without the mask, and the face beneath it was worse than she ever imagined. The news broke before sunrise. Elaine Whitmore arrested the real mastermind. FBI says mother, tycoon, traitor, the widow who orchestrated her son's murder. Charlotte sat alone in a corner booth of a diner off Route 5, her hood pulled low, black coffee growing cold in her hands. Above the counter, a flat-screen TV blasted the morning news. Elaine's mugshot filled the screen glasses off jaw-clenched eyes deadened with quiet defiance. The reporter's voice chirped. Elaine Whitmore, widow of Franklin Whitmore, was taken into federal custody at her family estate late last night. Prosecutors allege that she was not only complicit in the financial crimes of her late husband, but was in fact the architect of a long-running scheme involving political bribery, offshore laundering, and most disturbingly, complicity in the death of her son Liam Whitmore. Charlotte looked away. At the table beside her, two strangers whispered. I knew it, said the woman, shaking her head. You could always tell something was wrong with that family. Too clean, too polished. The man scoffed. You think the daughter knew? Charlotte blinked, her grip tightening around the cup. Outside, a wall of cameras waited. The moment she stepped out of the diner, the flashbulbs detonated like 1,000 tiny lightning strikes. Microphones were shoved in her face, voices layered over one another, desperate for blood. Ms. Whitmore, did you know what your mother was doing? Did you aid in the cover-up? Is it true you provided the footage that led to your father's arrest? Why did you wait so long to come forward? Do you consider yourself a victim or an accomplice? Charlotte kept walking. Straight back, steady steps. She didn't hide. She didn't run. She stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, turned to face them, and removed her hood. The cameras clicked faster. I was born into a house built on secrets, she said, her voice calm, unwavering. For most of my life, I believed what I was told. But when I learned the truth, I made a choice. A beat. I chose to expose it. Silence. She looked into the camera, not at the reporters. I can't undo what my family did. I can't bring Liam back. But I can stand on the right side of the story. That's where I am now. She turned and walked away. The fallout came fast. Elaine was indicted on 8 counts within 24 hours, racketeering conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and fraud. Her bail was denied. She was moved to a high-security federal facility under round-the-clock surveillance. The Whitmore estate, once a symbol of untouchable prestige, was seized by the government. Assets frozen. Private records subpoenaed. And the lawsuits began to pile up like storm clouds. Victims from years past came forward, clients who had been silenced, employees who had been coerced, families destroyed by quiet payoffs and rigged verdicts. A former paralegal filed a $5 million lawsuit. A politician claimed his entire career had been blackmailed into submission. Even a judge. Each lawsuit added another fracture to the crumbling dynasty. And at the center of it, Charlotte. She stayed mostly silent in the days that followed, let the evidence speak louder than her name. But the media wouldn't let her vanish. Her inbox flooded with interview requests, talk shows, podcasts, investigative specials, book deals. They didn't care about the truth. They wanted a redemption arc, a scandal with high heels and clean tears. She refused them all until one morning she accepted a single interview with a small independent news outlet that had covered Liam's university blog years ago, back when he first started whispering about family corruption. The interviewer asked her point blank, "Did you know?" Charlotte didn't blink. "I knew pieces. I suspected more. And when I found out the whole truth, I didn't bury it. I brought it into the light." Another question. "Do you feel guilt?" She paused. "I feel responsibility. Do you still consider yourself a Whitmore?" Charlotte looked straight into the lens. "No, I consider myself a witness to what happens when we protect legacy over lives." The interview aired online. Quiet, clean, no music, no dramatization. Just a woman refusing to be part of the rot anymore. Days later, outside the federal courthouse, Charlotte watched as protesters gathered not against her, but against the Whitmore name. They held signs. "No more silence. Justice for Liam. Burn the bloodline." Some had spray-painted the estate gates. Others left candles, letters, photographs. One old man wept openly, holding a court file that bore her father's signature, a document that had cost him custody of his grandchildren 20 years ago. Charlotte approached him. "I'm sorry," she said simply. The man nodded, trembling. "He destroyed my life." "I know," she whispered. "I'm trying to make sure he can't destroy anyone else's." He didn't smile, but he didn't walk away either. That night, Charlotte sat in what used to be Franklin's office, now just a hollowed room filled with empty bookshelves and stripped cabinets. The walls were bare. No portraits, no plaques, just silence. She opened Liam's journal, scanned the pages. One passage circled in red ink. "If I disappear, don't stop it, Dad. Look deeper. She's the one pulling strings." He'd known. He'd always known. Charlotte closed the book, and for the first time in weeks she cried, not just for Liam, but for the child she'd once been, who had spent years believing her mother's softness was safety, that her father's charisma was comfort, that legacy meant something worth inheriting. Now she knew better. And knowing meant never looking away again. The morning of the demolition was colder than expected. Gray clouds loomed low over Westbridge, as if the sky itself knew something sacred was about to fall. Charlotte stood at the edge of the estate grounds, arms crossed, her black coat billowing in the breeze. Before her rose the Whitmore mansion, once a symbol of legacy, power, and deception. Its towering white columns, its ivy-wrapped balconies, the grand double doors that had welcomed senators and silenced victims, it all stood still, unaware that it would soon become dust. A row of yellow excavators lined the property like soldiers awaiting orders. Behind her, news vans and local reporters crowded near the barricades. Protesters, former clients, and curious townsfolk watched with mixed expressions, awe, disbelief, hunger for closure. The estate had been emptied. Everything inside, from silverware monogrammed with W to the crystal chandeliers Franklin once bragged were imported from Austria, had been sold at auction the night before. All proceeds were earmarked for restitution to victims. Not a penny would remain in Whitmore hands. Charlotte had made sure of it. She walked up the temporary stage set in front of the mansion, microphone in hand. She didn't need a script. "My name is Charlotte Whitmore," she said. "And today I am erasing the place that built me and broke so many others." Gasps. Camera clicks. She looked back at the house, then at the crowd. This estate was paid for with blood and silence. It stood on lies upheld by fear and protected by people who thought their power made them untouchable. That ends today. She turned toward the excavator, climbed the metal steps, and entered the operator's cabin. Inside, she placed both hands on the levers. One of the workers hesitated beside her. "Ma'am, are you sure you want to do it yourself?" Charlotte didn't even blink. "No one else gets to tear this place down." The machine roared to life. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters held their breath. And then the metal arms swung forward with a thunderous hiss. The first strike hit the Eastern Wing Franklin's office. The marble crumbled like sugar. Glass exploded. The roof groaned in surrender. Another strike, and another. Charlotte never flinched. Each blow felt like a breath she hadn't been allowed to take in years. She remembered standing behind those walls as a girl being taught how to walk, like a Whitmore speak, like a Whitmore lie, like a Whitmore. Now she was unmaking all of it. Brick by brick. The media was relentless, swarming when she stepped down from the machine hours later. One reporter pushed forward, notepad in hand, eyes wide. "Ms. Whitmore, do you regret this? Do you regret destroying something so historic?" Charlotte paused, then looked straight at him. "I don't regret the past," she said. "I regret being quiet." The quote exploded across headlines by sundown. "I don't regret the past. I regret being quiet." Charlotte Whitmore. The house that lied. Whitmore estate falls. Daughter of corruption, agent of justice. But none of it touched her. She didn't go home after the demolition because home no longer existed. Not in a physical sense. Not in the way people wanted it to. She went to the edge of the cleared foundation. The earth was bare now, scorched and raw. Construction tape fluttered in the wind. A single sycamore tree stood nearby, untouched, its roots deep enough to survive both family and fire. Charlotte stood beneath it and closed her eyes. Liam had loved that tree. They used to climb it as kids, share secrets in its branches. The only place on the entire estate where truth felt safe. She whispered aloud, "It's gone now, Lee, every trace." But in her chest a whisper answered, "Not every trace." Because from the ashes of the house something new would rise. She wasn't done yet. The demolition wasn't the end. It was a foundation. For something better, for something just. Months passed. The estate that once cast a shadow over Westbridge was now nothing more than a memory. And a construction site. But beneath the hum of machinery, something else stirred, something living, something sacred. On the exact plot where the Whitmore mansion once loomed, a new structure was rising. Not marble, not iron-gated luxury. This time it was something humbler, brighter, with open courtyards, glass walls, and rooms named after people whose stories had once been silenced. The sign out front read, "Liam House, a haven for truth-tellers." Charlotte stood in the heart of the main hall, her hand resting on a plaque that bore her brother's name. Her eyes were glassy but steady. A group of staff and volunteers moved quietly through the corridors, lawyers, counselors, social workers, survivors. Here people weren't asked to keep secrets. They were asked what it took to finally speak them. She watched as a young woman stepped into the front lobby, mid-20s, bruises under her eyes, a manila folder clutched tight to her chest. She hesitated. The guard smiled gently and waved her in. Charlotte nodded to herself. "That's why we're here." Inside the main office, Ethan stood waiting, suit-pressed, Justice Department pin on his lapel. He held something in his hands, polished wood and brass. When she entered, he turned to her, smiling. "I'm not sure the DOJ usually gives these to people who used to share last names with federal criminals," he said. Charlotte raised a brow. "I'm not sure I care." He chuckled, then held it out. It was a framed citation in recognition of extraordinary courage in pursuit of truth and for rebuilding where others destroyed. She stared at it, then back at him. "No one thought a Whitmore could do this," he said. Charlotte tilted her head. "They weren't wrong. The old Whitmores couldn't. But you're not them." She nodded, her voice soft. "Not anymore." He stepped closer. "You know there are entire departments at Justice watching this place. Watching you. Wondering how you'll pull it off." "I'm not pulling it off," she said. "I'm just giving people the thing my family stole from them." "What's that?" She met his eyes. "A place where telling the truth doesn't get you killed." Later that afternoon, she walked through one of the meeting rooms. A teenage boy sat across from a therapist, his voice barely above a whisper as he described the things his foster father had done. In another wing, a woman clutched a notebook full of testimony she'd never dared share in court. Each room told a different version of the same story, someone once punished for doing the right thing. Now they had shelter, counsel, legal protection, safety. Liam would have been proud. He'd always said the house should belong to the people it hurt. Now it did. As the sun dipped behind the rebuilt frame of the new center, Charlotte sat outside on a wooden bench beneath the old sycamore tree. The one thing she hadn't destroyed. the one place where she and Liam used to escape the weight of their last name. She pulled out a small box from her coat. Inside was the watch Liam wore every day. It had been in evidence lockup for nearly a year until the case against Elaine closed. Now it was hers again. She fastened it around her wrist. "Everything you were fighting for," she whispered. "It's here now." She looked out at the Liam house. No more hiding, no more silence. Her phone buzzed. A reporter again asking for a new interview. She turned it off. She didn't need headlines anymore. She had something better, a building where justice was no longer bought, buried, or bartered. It was earned one truth at a time. The dust had barely settled. The last piece of the Whitmore estate, once a towering monument to old power, lay crushed beneath the mechanical jaws of Charlotte's demolition crew. What once stood as a fortress of generational silence and manipulation was now reduced to soil clay and quiet. But Charlotte Whitmore wasn't done. In the weeks that followed, blueprints unfurled where wine-stained ledgers once sat. Surveyors walked the hill with tablets instead of torches, and for the first time in decades, the breeze that moved through the land wasn't heavy with secrets. It carried something gentler, lighter, like a whisper of redemption. Construction began fast. The community, still shocked by the public arrest of Franklin and Elaine Whitmore, watched as cement trucks rolled in. There were murmurs, of course, speculation. But they didn't know the full picture. Charlotte wasn't just building something new, she was rewriting a legacy. She named it Liam House in memory of the boy who never got the chance to be more than a pawn. The front entrance bore no grand archway, no bronze crest. Instead, it was framed with wild ivy and a wooden sign etched in clean, deliberate lettering, a safe place for those who dared to speak truth. Inside, Liam House was not like any official building. No surveillance cameras, no sterile lights, just warm-toned walls, worn-in furniture, and quiet spaces to cry, scream, or say nothing at all. Each room had a name: the listening room, the archive, the quiet bay, the truth garden. Charlotte walked through the halls slowly that morning. Her heels echoed lightly on the polished concrete floors, the only remnants of what had once been the basement where her brother's truth had been hidden. Now, it had become a sanctuary for others like him, people who were punished not for doing wrong, but for exposing it. She stepped into the intake area. A young woman sat at the front, no older than 20, biting her nails and looking over her shoulder repeatedly. A teenage boy beside her kept his head down, hoodie pulled low, but his trembling hand gave away everything. Charlotte didn't speak first. She never did. After a long moment, the girl finally looked up. Her voice cracked like a dry branch. "They said they'd come after me because I talked." Charlotte's voice was steady. "Then this is exactly where you need to be." They had no idea she understood all too well what it meant to say something no one wanted to hear. What it cost to speak truth in a world that rewarded silence. An hour later, Charlotte sat in her new office, small, cluttered, and still carrying that smell of fresh paint and wood glue. She stared at the photo on her desk, Liam and her as kids' faces sticky from lemonade dirt on their cheeks, laughing at something long forgotten. A knock at the door pulled her back. It was Ethan. He wore his badge today not as intimidation, but as acknowledgement. With a crooked smile, he stepped inside, holding a leather folder. "I was told by the Department of Justice to deliver this in person," he said, placing it gently on her desk. She opened it. Inside, a federal certificate of commendation. Official, sealed, awarded to Charlotte Whitmore for unwavering courage and civil contribution in the pursuit of institutional justice. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stared at it. Not because she wanted it, but because once it would have been impossible. "No one thought someone with your last name could do this," Ethan said quietly, his tone devoid of sarcasm. "You proved them wrong." She looked up at him, her eyes not proud, just clear. "I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it because I couldn't keep pretending anymore." He nodded. "Still, you changed things." She traced the raised edges of the certificate for a beat, then closed the folder and slid it to the side. "I'll hang it in the hallway, right above Liam's picture." There was a pause, the kind where you feel history shift slightly. Ethan cleared his throat, placing his hand on the back of the chair. "There's talk, you know, that Liam House might expand, that what you've built here could become a model." Charlotte looked out the window. Kids were planting herbs in the truth garden. A woman was helping someone learn to read aloud on the bench. No cameras, no press, just people healing in small, unremarkable ways. "Let them talk," she said. "I'm not chasing attention. I'm just trying to build something my brother would have been proud of." Ethan smiled softly. He'd be more than proud. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. That night, when the last light in Liam House flicked off and the gates quietly clicked shut, Charlotte stood alone in the hallway beside a framed quote, "Truth isn't a weapon, it's a light switch." And beneath it a smaller plaque, dedicated to Liam Whitmore, the light we failed to protect and the reason we never stopped trying. She ran her fingers over his name. The letters were cool, unyielding, but to her they still hummed with memory. Outside, the moon hung low over the ruins of the old Whitmore estate. The land was no longer haunted, it was hallowed. And Charlotte, once the girl who buried her voice under silk dresses and false smiles, had finally spoken. Not with rage, not with vengeance, but with purpose. And this time the world listened. The courthouse air was always the same, cold, sterile, and heavy, but today it felt especially thick. Charlotte sat on the hallway bench just outside Family Courtroom 2B, her fingers laced together, watching the boy across from her. He looked about 11. Freckles dusted across his nose. His jacket was 2 sizes too big. He kept his eyes locked on the floor as his caseworker whispered something beside him, but he didn't respond. A small cut above his brow, a sleeve pulled over a bruised wrist. Charlotte had seen that silence before. She used to live in it. She stood up slow and soft and crossed the hall. "Hey," she said gently, kneeling beside the bench. "Can I sit?" The boy glanced at her, then shrugged. She sat. For a moment, neither said anything. Then she looked ahead, her voice calm. "You know, I used to know someone who sat just like that in this courthouse. Small, quiet, angry at the world." The boy turned slightly. "He used to say that being brave didn't mean you weren't scared. It just meant you chose to speak anyway." The boy mumbled. Did he get to go home? Charlotte's throat tightened. She smiled, but it was the kind that carried ache beneath it. "No," she said. "He didn't." His eyes widened. "But because of him, a lot of other kids do now." They walked side by side that afternoon, Charlotte and the boy whose name was Marcus, through the open courtyard of Liam House. The sky had turned a soft gold, and the autumn breeze tugged gently at the sleeves of their jackets. In her hands, Charlotte held a small potted plant lavender, Liam's favorite. "Come on," she said, nodding toward a patch of earth just outside the main entrance. "Let's plant it right here." Marcus hesitated. "I don't know how." "That's okay," she smiled. "No one does the first time." They crouched together. She showed him how to loosen the soil with his fingers, press the roots down gently, then pat the earth like a secret you wanted to keep safe. As they worked, she told him about Liam, not the death, but the life. He loved trees, she said. Used to believe they could listen. He'd tell them everything, his dreams, his fears, what he hated about our father. Marcus asked, "Did he hate your dad?" Charlotte stared into the dirt. "No. I think he just wanted him to be someone worth loving." They planted in silence after that. When it was done, Marcus stood back, brushing dirt off his hands. "It doesn't look like much," he muttered. "Neither did Liam at first," Charlotte said, her voice catching. "But what he started is growing everywhere now." She turned to him, her eyes steady. "He didn't survive, but you can." Marcus looked at her for the first time, not with fear, but recognition. Hope. The kind that starts small like a root and grows because someone finally dared to believe it could. Later, inside the quiet of her office, Charlotte stared out the window toward the lavender plant now nestled under the sycamore. Marcus had gone home with his caseworker, just a temporary placement, but it was safer than before. He had a legal advocate now, a counselor, and a promise that this time someone would listen. Charlotte closed her eyes and breathed deeply. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about what came after justice. The rebuilding, the healing, the making sure no one else was left behind just because they weren't born into power. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out Liam's final journal. There were only 3 pages left blank at the end. She took out a pen and wrote slowly, "Today I planted you again. You live in this place. You saved a boy who might have never been heard. You're not gone, Liam. You're just blooming differently." She closed the book, and for the first time in years, the silence around her felt full, not empty, filled with roots and lavender and legacy finally rewritten. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with her name written in a familiar slant. No return address, but she didn't need one. Charlotte stared at it on her desk for nearly a day before she opened it. It arrived through the Liam House mailbox, dropped off by a quiet man in a gray uniform who didn't wait around. She knew who had sent it. Her father, Franklin Whitmore, former legal architect of the nation's most protected corruption network. Now prisoner number 61497, serving a life sentence in a federal facility far from marble halls and velvet chairs. The paper inside trembled slightly in her hand. She unfolded it. "Charlotte, I imagine you'll burn this before you ever read it. I wouldn't blame you. There are no excuses for what I did. You were right to destroy what I built. It wasn't a legacy, it was a cage. I only hope you understand now. I was terrified of what would happen if the truth got out. And I made decisions that buried more than just evidence. I buried my own son. I still see his face in my sleep. You stood in the fire I couldn't face. You did what I couldn't. For that, I am sorry. For everything. Your father, Franklin. Charlotte sat still for a long time. The letter rested on her knees, her hands loose at her sides. Outside her office window, the day was ending. She rose slowly like a woman carrying too many ghosts and walked to her car. The beach was cold this time of year, windy, wild, untamed. The kind of place where no one expected you to pretend. Charlotte walked barefoot across the sand, the letter clutched in her hand. Seagulls wheeled overhead. The tide thundered as if trying to drown memory itself. She stopped near a rocky outcrop where the sea foamed white and furious. She unfolded the letter again and read it, this time all the way through. There were no tears, just a hollow breath at the end. She pulled a lighter from her coat pocket, the same silver one Liam had once stolen from their father's drawer as a prank. It clicked open with a flick that echoed louder than it should have. The flame curled along the edge of the page. She held it carefully as the fire spread the ink, warping the apologies turning to ash. She let the wind take the last blackened shred, watched it dance into the surf. The sea accepted it without question, just as it had accepted every other secret their family had buried. She stood there in silence, hair whipping around her face, eyes narrowed not in grief, but clarity. And then her voice came soft at first, then stronger, as if telling a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. "I'm not Charlotte Whitmore," she said. Her boots dug into the sand. "I'm not the heir to a dynasty." The waves howled. "I'm not the daughter of a man who covered blood with gold." She turned from the sea, the last of the letter now gone. "I'm the one who told the story." She walked back toward her car, leaving no footprints behind. Just the scent of burnt paper, and the rising tide of a life no longer chained to a name. The morning news rolled across every television in the waiting lounge, the volume turned down, but the headline bold and unmistakable, "Liam House, 1 year later, a new standard for justice centers nationwide." The footage showed sweeping drone shots of the coastal center, its glass windows catching the morning light. Its walls painted with murals of trees, survivors, and phrases like, "Truth deserves shelter." Cut to interviews. Former victims, now mentors, staff members from underserved communities, and district attorneys quietly admitting they're doing something we never could. Charlotte stood by the window in the main hallway, coffee in hand, watching a child draw on a chalkboard wall. One of the staff passed by and said, "We're booked for 6 months straight. Arizona's calling next. They want to model their safe house after us." Charlotte gave a quiet nod. She didn't need credit, she needed permanence. Just then the reception door creaked open. A girl, 18, maybe younger, stepped inside. Her backpack hung loose on one shoulder. Her eyes scanned the room like she expected someone to stop her. No one did. Charlotte turned toward her, walked up slowly. "Hi," Charlotte said. The girl looked up. Her face-pale lips cracked expression unreadable, but her eyes were unmistakable. Charlotte saw herself, years ago. Scarred, guarded, desperate not to be seen, yet aching to be found. The girl opened her mouth, then closed it again. Charlotte tried again. "Are you looking for someone?" I don't know," the girl whispered. Someone told me this place." Charlotte waited. "Was where people like me go when no one believes us." Charlotte took a breath. She stepped closer. "No one needs to believe your past here," she said. "We believe your right to a future." Tears welled in the girl's eyes. Charlotte reached into her pocket and handed her a small pin, a lavender branch with Liam's initials engraved on the stem. The girl stared at it, then held it like something sacred. Charlotte smiled gently. "You found the right place." The girl nodded and they walked together down the hallway. In one of the therapy gardens, 2 children giggled while chasing butterflies near the raised flower beds. A social worker read poetry aloud under the sycamore. A mural in progress glistened in the sun, half-finished brushstrokes dancing in soft blues and bright orange. Charlotte watched from a distance as the new girl sat in a circle with others still quiet, but no longer alone. A reporter stepped up to her quietly. "Ms. Ms. Charlotte," he corrected, holding a small notebook. "Do you ever think about what you gave up?" Charlotte turned to him. "I didn't give anything up," she said. "I reclaimed something." The reporter hesitated. "And what's that?" Charlotte looked back at the girl in the group. Her voice was firm, clear. "A legacy worth passing on." Behind her, the new girl smiled. The kind of smile that said, "I didn't think I'd make it this far." And Charlotte smiled too. Because now she did. The wind rolled quietly across the hill where the Whitmore estate once stood. Gone were the iron gates, the stone lions, the stained glass windows that once filtered lies through the sun. In their place, an open field unruly with tall grass and scattered wildflowers soft yellow against the sky, like a place the earth had been waiting to reclaim. Charlotte stood alone, camera slung over her shoulder. She hadn't been back since the demolition, since the day she watched the past crumble beneath the claw of a machine and felt for the first time lighter. Now only memory whispered here. She walked carefully across the slope, her boots brushing through the grass until she reached a small rise where an old oak once shaded a window. She stopped, her breath catching not from exhaustion but recognition. This was it. The library used to be here, the place where her father read her bedtime stories from law books, twisting truth into lullabies. The place where Liam once whispered, "There's something hidden under the floor." The place where she first held the truth in her shaking hands and decided she'd never be silent again. Charlotte pulled the camera from her shoulder. Framed in the viewfinder, a soft expanse of green, one beam of broken stone jutting from the ground like a forgotten punctuation mark. The clouds hung open low and moving. The light was just right. She pressed the shutter. Click. She lowered the camera, blinked once, and just stood there. There were no ghosts here, only the memory of silence and the woman who had walked away from it. Back at Liam House, the photo rested on Charlotte's desk, printed in matte, no filter, no framing. Just the truth, raw and quiet. She slid it into a clear holder and placed it between two brass paperweights. Beneath it, she'd written a single sentence in permanent black ink. "This is where I buried silence." The sentence wasn't for visitors. It wasn't for the press or the donors or the clients. It was for her. For the girl who once pressed her ear against the walls of a mansion to hear what her family was hiding. For the sister who once thought justice meant making noise. Now she knew better. Justice meant listening when no one else would. And truth, it wasn't loud. It was consistent. Charlotte leaned back in her chair and watched the sun filter through the office window. In the courtyard outside, a new mural had begun to form. Bright colors. A tree growing out of a crack in concrete. Children had painted it themselves. She smiled just slightly. Then she turned back to her work and left the door open. The dust had barely settled. The last piece of the Whitmore estate, once a towering monument to old power, lay crushed beneath the mechanical jaws of Charlotte's demolition crew. What once stood as a fortress of generational silence and manipulation was now reduced to soil clay and quiet. But Charlotte Whitmore wasn't done. In the weeks that followed, blueprints unfurled where wine-stained ledgers once sat. Surveyors walked the hill with tablets instead of torches. And for the first time in decades, the breeze that moved through the land wasn't heavy with secrets. It carried something gentler, lighter, like a whisper of redemption. Construction began fast. The community, still shocked by the public arrest of Franklin and Elaine Whitmore, watched as cement trucks rolled in. There were murmurs, of course. Speculation. But they didn't know the full picture. Charlotte wasn't just building something new. She was rewriting a legacy. She named it Liam House in memory of the boy who never got the chance to be more than a pawn. The front entrance bore no grand archway, no bronze crest. Instead, it was framed with wild ivy and a wooden sign etched in clean, deliberate lettering, a safe place for those who dared to speak truth. Inside, Liam House was not like any official building. No surveillance cameras, no sterile lights, just warm-toned walls, worn-in furniture, and quiet spaces to cry, scream, or say nothing at all. Each room had a name: the listening room, the archive, the quiet bay, the truth garden. Charlotte walked through the halls slowly that morning. Her heels echoed lightly on the polished concrete floors, the only remnants of what had once been the basement where her brother's truth had been hidden. Now it had become a sanctuary for others like him, people who were punished not for doing wrong, but for exposing it. She stepped into the intake area. A young woman sat at the front, no older than 20, biting her nails and looking over her shoulder repeatedly. A teenage boy beside her kept his head down, hoodie pulled low, but his trembling hand gave away everything. Charlotte didn't speak first. She never did. After a long moment, the girl finally looked up. Her voice cracked like a dry branch. "They said they'd come after me, because I talked." Charlotte's voice was steady. "Then this is exactly where you need to be." They had no idea she understood all too well what it meant to say something no one wanted to hear. What it cost to speak truth in a world that rewarded silence. An hour later, Charlotte sat in her new office, small, cluttered, and still carrying that smell of fresh paint and wood glue. She stared at the photo on her desk, Liam and her, as kids' faces sticky from lemonade dirt on their cheeks, laughing at something long forgotten. A knock at the door pulled her back. It was Ethan. He wore his badge today not as intimidation, but as acknowledgement. With a crooked smile, he stepped inside, holding a leather folder. "I was told by the Department of Justice to deliver this in person," he said, placing it gently on her desk. She opened it. Inside, a federal certificate of commendation. Official. Sealed. Awarded to Charlotte Whitmore for unwavering courage and civil contribution in the pursuit of institutional justice. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stared at it. Not because she wanted it, but because once it would have been impossible. No one thought someone with your last name could do this, Ethan said quietly, his tone devoid of sarcasm. You prove them wrong. She looked up at him, her eyes not proud, just clear. I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it because I couldn't keep pretending anymore. He nodded. Still, you changed things. She traced the raised edges of the certificate for a beat, then closed the folder and slid it to the side. I'll hang it in the hallway, right above Liam's picture. There was a pause, the kind where you feel history shift slightly. Ethan cleared his throat, placing his hand on the back of the chair. There's talk, that Liam House might expand, that what you've built here could become a model. Charlotte looked out the window. Kids were planting herbs in the truth garden. A woman was helping someone learn to read aloud on the bench. No cameras, no press, just people healing in small, unremarkable ways. Let them talk, she said. I'm not chasing attention. I'm just trying to build something my brother would have been proud of. Ethan smiled softly. He'd be more than proud. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. That night, when the last light in Liam House flicked off and the gates quietly clicked shut, Charlotte stood alone in the hallway beside a framed quote. Truth isn't a weapon, it's a light switch. And beneath it a smaller plaque, dedicated to Liam Whitmore, the light we failed to protect and the reason we never stopped trying. She ran her fingers over his name. The letters were cool, unyielding, but to her they still hummed with memory. Outside, the moon hung low over the ruins of the old Whitmore estate. The land was no longer haunted. It was hallowed. And Charlotte, once the girl who buried her voice under silk dresses and false smiles, had finally spoken. Not with rage, not with vengeance, but with purpose. And this time the world listened.